What's up, everyone? It's Tony from the HowToCatholic podcast, and I want to jump on before you start listening to let you know that the opinions and commentary expressed in the podcast today may not be the exact beliefs of the Catholic Church. They are opinions and should be treated as such. Just wanted to give you a heads up about that. Also, there is going to be one swear word in today's podcast, but I bleeped it out for you. You are welcome. Now enjoy the podcast today.
How to Catholic.
And welcome to another How to Catholic podcast. My name is Tony, and really excited because today we actually have a guest on the podcast. Super excited. My friend Rielley is here with me right now, and we got some super cool stuff to talk about. I've known Rielley for a couple of years now, and when I was telling people that I wanted to do a podcast and that I was making a website, he offered to write some things, and he said, I want to help you write some things, and if you want me to come on your podcast, I'd love to do it. And I'm like, sweet. So Rielley, thank you for coming on to the podcast today.
Glad to be here.
Awesome. So we're going to talk a little bit about your writing later, because you're writing some articles for the website ain'tthatcatholic.squarespace.com. But first, I thought we'd talk about a topic that we were both interested in. You're one of the people who encouraged me to actually get interested in this topic, and that is Game of Thrones. Because you really wanted me to start watching Game of Thrones like last year, and I was kind of resistant to it. But you kept encouraging me, and then I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna watch it. So thank you for that, Rielley, because I've really enjoyed Game of Thrones now.
Yeah, I'm certainly glad of that, and I knew you would.
How did you actually get into Game of Thrones? I want to start out with that, because you read the books before you started watching the TV show, didn't you?
Well, it was a bit complex. I had been encouraged to read the books by others, but not really very aggressively. Eventually I figured I'd give the show a shot, so I watched the first season in a couple of days. And after that, I read all the books, then I finished watching the series. And, of course, loved every page and every minute.
Because it's a ridiculously cool show. I didn't quite know what to expect when I was getting into it, but you kept hearing these buzzwords like King Joffrey and the Red Wedding. And that was like all season 3 stuff when the show started actually getting, super big. Like, and people started to recognize, oh my gosh, this is an actual show. And what did you think of watching the show versus like reading the books? Because I've never read the books before. How different is it from the actual TV show?
Well, it does vary. The first season is a bit more in line with the books. Later, there are some more changes, and the storylines kind of get out of sync because some of them move along at a faster pace than others. As for the experience of reading as compared to watching, is different because with the books, you can just plow right through them. No problem. I got through them at a rate of a book a week during the summer of last year. Whereas with the show, you gotta wait a week for a new episode to come out, then almost a whole nother year for a new season.
Mm-hmm.
So watching the show requires more patience, that's for sure.
It does. I mean, I was lucky because by the time I started watching the show, my roommate got me all 3 seasons on DVD. But did you actually keep up with the show like weekly, or did you at one point marathon it?
I started by marathoning. I marathoned the first season, and then after I finished the books, I did the same for the second and third seasons. The fourth, I couldn't marathon because by that point I was caught up and had to wait for it week by week.
Nice. And being a history major, you probably see the show a little bit differently than I do, and probably other people do as well. When you're watching or reading the show, what kind of approach do you take to it? Like, how do you see the show in like the grand scheme of things?
Well, mainly I watch it for entertainment. However, I can't resist historical analysis because it is chock full of analogies and allegories. I mean, the entire central conflict of the series was inspired by the Wars of the Roses, which, for those of you who don't know, was a period of civil war in England during the 15th century. But I won't really get into detail of that, just that it was George R. R. Martin's main inspiration for the conflict itself, the War of the Five Kings, as it's called in the series.
And that was also, I believe, Shakespeare used the War of the Roses as the backdrop for some of his stories, didn't he?
Well, some of Shakespeare's plays took place during that conflict, most famously Richard III.
Mm-hmm.
Richard III's death at the Battle of Bosworth Field was what marked the end of that conflict.
Right. So do you just kind of watch this and see where you can see the historical kind of significance in each part, or do you kind of just look back on a season and think to yourself, okay, I can see where he was drawing inspiration from at some point in time?
Well, I did try to I did make some guesses as to where some inspirations may have come from. When I got really curious, I did try to look up what he said his inspirations came from, because he has talked about it before. Like, for example, without getting into too much detail about the event itself, the Red Wedding, he based on two events in Scottish history known as the Black Dinner and the Glencoe Massacre. Both were instances of both were instances of hospitality being breached, of either guests turning on their hosts or hosts turning on their guests. And other things too. He has talked about his direct inspirations, like, for example, or some things you don't even doesn't require for him to talk about, like with religions in Westeros. Some of them are pretty clear analogies to real world religions.
Mm-hmm.
For example, as Catholics, we would recognize a lot of similarities between the Faith of the Seven and Catholicism, even though it does have some pagan elements thrown in.
Really? Because I was thinking the ones who follow, there's that woman who follows the light, like, and she, and Stannis, like, has her as kind of one of his main strategists.
Melisandre.
Yeah, I was thinking, like, seems kind of parallel to Catholicism, but you're saying it was the old gods that the people of the North usually worshipped?
Yeah. In the North, they keep the old gods, which Martin drew influence from paganism for that. Largely from Celtic, some Germanic, because it's a system of largely nature worship with many, many gods, all of them nameless, very animistic. The Faith of the Seven has its roots in Catholicism, particularly in medieval Europe.
Okay.
In that it is structured in the same way. There is a clergy and a hierarchy. And next season we'll see more of that. For book readers, they can all look forward to meeting the High Sparrow. You soon will know what that means.
I'm excited.
And yeah, the structure also, the seven themselves are seven aspects of one deity, just like we have the Trinity. Even though the seven themselves individually seem to draw more from paganism than anything else. Mm-hmm. So there's a bit of syncretism in there. And as for your question about the worship of Rielley, the Lord of Light,
yeah,
that draws most of its influence from Zoroastrianism.
Really?
As Martin himself has said. In that it's a dualistic religion with one essentially good god, the god of light, and another of cold and darkness and death.
Okay.
As his adversary, and also the use of fire as a symbol and as a purifying element.
Interesting. You were talking about influences, and I've read about, I mentioned in the first podcast when I was talking about Game of Thrones, how Martin in interviews, he's acknowledged Tolkien as kind of an influence, as just because, when you're writing an epic story, you can't help but draw from Tolkien's work. But do you see any like Tolkien elements in Game of Thrones? Because in the interviews, he said that even though he admires Tolkien's work, their works are definitely vastly different.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, I'd say most of the influence from Tolkien comes from the fact that one, it's a fantasy world, and two, I know you haven't read the books, but the books themselves are stylistically definitely influenced by Tolkien. There's the use of multiple characters for perspective. Also, in some of the ways the plots are pushed forward, like for example, there's a more restrained use of magic in both Game of Thrones and in Tolkien's work.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like Harry Potter where the magic is very visible and always present, always being used.
Yeah.
It's definitely a more reserved, restrained use. You don't see it directly all that often.
That's true. Like, compared to other fantasy series, actually, I've never really thought about how little actual magic happens in the Lord of the Rings series. Even though they have a wizard there with them, there's very few instances of actual magic that happen there. I've never thought of that before.
Yeah, but I'd say that is a stylistic and story writing influence from Martin.
True.
But it is important to realize, however, that Martin does sort of depart from Tolkien's model in a lot of ways,
mm-hmm.
particularly in the sort of world that it is. It's a darker, more morally ambiguous type of world.
Yeah, that's the best phrase for it. From what I understand, is in Tolkien's work, you can clearly see who's on the side of good and who's on the side of evil. Versus Martin's work, like everyone has a bit of good and evil inside of them, and they're like fighting to see which one is going to, reign supreme in their lives.
Yeah, I'd say is a great strength for Game of Thrones because it makes the characters more compelling.
Mm-hmm. And do you have a favorite character in the series, or do you not want to say anything for people who haven't read the books yet? Because you probably want to pick a character who's actually still alive by the end of the books at this point.
Well, you're right in that I don't want to spoil anything. And that's for favorite character. It's a really difficult decision just because one, character's always dying off.
True.
And two, they're always shifting as well. Your perspectives on them change. I'd say probably like everyone else, my favorite character is Tyrion.
Yeah.
However, even though I still like Tyrion, even though he always remains a very likable character, even with him, the perspective changes. Like, without giving things away, as you're aware, at the end of this past season, his storyline took a rather dark turn.
Yeah, really.
It's something he's not really going to bounce back from psychologically.
Mm-hmm.
So even though he remains the very likable, is always his intelligent, wisecracking self. He's past a certain point of no return, and it is definitely a change for him and a change for the way we see him.
Yeah, because definitely at the end of the season, it was just like him getting hit with a hammer, like over the head, over and over and over again. Especially just like that last episode where you're just like, oh my gosh, that's just really sad. I mean, one of the things that I love and I hate about the show is that you want some sort of happy ending. You want something good to happen, but every time you get some glimmer of something good about to happen, it just, all this bad stuff just piles on top of it. And like, you can never actually just get like a clean victory, and you can never like say to yourself, yes, this is a good moment. Something just happened for, the better of this show, or in the better of this world.
Yeah, that's the thing about a morally ambiguous universe like this. In the end, nothing is really a happy ending. I mean, Martin himself, without giving away the ending to his own series, which is not complete yet, has said that the ending is probably going to be bittersweet. Because
all right.
At this point, there's really no other way for it to end.
That's true. Though I personally, my favorite ending that I thought of would be somehow just all of the younger people in the show, they find their way to each other and they're like, you know what? Our parents are kind of idiots. Let's just kill all of them and rule this country ourselves. And that's what happens, because I feel like the younger people in the show, like, they're out there surviving and doing stuff, and the older ones are just trying to see if they can one-up each other.
Yeah, however, you gotta realize that these feuds do run deep.
Mm-hmm.
And as has been oft repeated in the show, the North remembers.
I'm excited though, like, especially I want to see how the White Walkers kind of turn out in this show, because I don't know, they're coming at some point. I'm hoping they're coming at some point. I want to see how the world kind of reacts when they have to put aside whatever feuds are going on and be like, hey, we got this bigger problem coming down on us from the North. So yeah, we got to deal with this right now.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to really further elaborate on that because I don't want to get into any potential spoilers. Though I mean, because the series is still incomplete, there would still only be so much I could say.
And can you tell for us who are just watching the show, is season 5 going to be a very epic season? Or should we be very excited for this season?
Well, yeah, there will be exciting stuff that happens for sure. I mean, we've seen some of it isn't necessarily really exciting, but still interesting to watch. Like, just you will acquire a morbid fascination.
Oh boy!
For like with what will be going on in King's Landing.
Really?
Even though you don't really see a lot of like crazy action happening, it'll be interesting. I'll just say that.
All right. One last thing I want to talk about before we're going to wrap this up is I talked about in the first podcast, one of the reasons I brought up Game of Thrones is because while it is a very compelling story, there is a lot of material in it since it is on HBO, and since you pay for HBO can basically do whatever they want with the show, and because there is a lot of inappropriateness that goes on in the show. How do you see that in the show? Like, do you just tend to ignore it, or do you kind of just be like, this is something that happens in the past and we just kind of have to deal with it?
Well, a lot of that stuff isn't necessarily stuff that happened in the past. It's just stuff that the producers of the show put in to appeal to some of their demographics that pay for this kind of thing.
Okay.
However, of course, with some stuff like the violence, it is stuff that's happens in the real world. We gotta sort of come to grips with it. I mean, Martin himself said that he was talking about being inspired for writing The Red Wedding by the aforementioned Black Dinner and Glencoe Massacre. He said, no matter how much I make up, there's always stuff in history that's just as bad or worse.
True.
And in general, for the nudity and all that stuff, I guess I have to look past it. I mean, I don't like it, but I realize it's HBO. They got to put this kind of stuff on.
Yeah.
And I just have to my advice would be for anyone who has any hang-ups with that, just look past and realize it's a great show, great storyline, very compelling characters. Just get past that first hurdle and you will absolutely love it.
That's definitely what I'm trying to do with it. Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to be talking about a little bit of history of Catholicism. Rielley is writing some awesome articles for the website, ain'tthatcatholic.squarespace.com. Check it out for more, and we will be right back. And welcome back to the How to Catholic podcast. I'm still here with Rielley, and after an awesome discussion about Game of Thrones, I want to talk about something else that is equally awesome. Rielley, as I mentioned before, is a history major, and when I was telling him and others about my plans to create the website, ain'tthatcatholic.squarespace.com, he asked if he could write an article about the history of American Catholicism. And I'm like, sure. And he's like, well, it'd be too long to make just one article. Could I write a couple different articles? And I'm like, yeah, that sounds awesome. So we're going to be looking forward to those in a couple weeks. But Rielley, what do you hope that people will get out of your articles?
Well, one thing that I've always really noticed about American Catholics is that we tend to take our rather easy life in this country for granted. The rights and liberties that we enjoy as United States citizens. One thing I noticed growing up was that in my history textbooks in elementary, middle school, very little discussion was ever presented about Catholics in this country, and especially not about the ways in which not only did Catholics not always enjoy the rights and liberties of Americans, but there was a long time in which Catholics were either deliberately denied those rights, or those rights and liberties existed in direct opposition to Catholicism. Something that very few people really know about or think about.
True. Usually when I think of the history of Catholicism, I go automatically to the Acts of the Apostles, because that's really the part of Catholicism historically that I know. And then after that, it's just bits and pieces about the popes and the First and Second Vatican Council. And after that, I don't know very much about the history of Catholicism in America, like in general.
Yeah, that's very true. And I mean, you could speak volumes, libraries about history of the Catholic Church. It's a 2,000-year tradition. However, in America, again, you could go back really far. For my articles, I will be starting in 17th century England and Ireland, rather than specifically in America or the American colonies of the time, because it's really there that you see the beginnings of the movements towards civil liberties and religious freedom that we call a proud American tradition today, and just how at the time Catholicism was a major issue. Only Catholics were seen in opposition to that sort of movement, which is something that a lot of people don't realize, mainly because, well, for one, the main focus is on the old world. Here we tend to focus entirely on what happened here, or not really go that much beyond what directly correlates to America.
That's true. And when you were giving me some of the topics that you wanted to cover in the articles you were going to write, and I believe one of the topics you said you wanted to cover was the Jacobites.
Yes.
And I was wondering, for anyone who doesn't know what that was, could you explain a little bit about what the Jacobites were?
Well, a little bit of background was that the last Catholic king of England, James II, was deposed by his daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange in what is known in British history as the Glorious Revolution. This ultimately resulted in William and Mary becoming king and queen, joint rulers, and various political reforms in England, such as the English Bill of Rights and the Act of Toleration. Those were seen as landmarks of political and civil liberty there. However, in regards to Catholicism, the Act of Toleration only gave freedom of worship and exemption from prosecutory laws to Protestant nonconformists to the Church of England. Catholics were excluded. And the Bill of Rights was drafted in response to the more absolutist and authoritarian leanings that James had taken on. And many equated that with Catholicism, particularly because at the time in France, England's enemy, it was the reign of Louis XIV, who was seen as the epitome of an absolute monarch, and he was very Catholic. So there came to be this connection at least in the minds of English and Protestants between Catholicism and absolutism, and that continued with the Jacobites, because the Jacobites were followers of James and his heirs. There were 3 rebellions, one in 1689, that was when laws came into effect, but ultimately he was defeated. He was not particularly well thought of even by his followers. He was a humorless, impersonal man whom even his own soldiers never saw much of. In Ireland, even among his ex-followers, became known as Seamus an Hacha, which means James the But there were still rebellions in the future in support of him and his heirs. His son, James Francis Stuart, and grandson, Charles Edward Stuart, better known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, who led the last rebellion in 1745. It was put down, but it generated a lot of fear. That fear was both sustained by and would ultimately spur on anti-Catholic sentiment in both the Old World and the New, in Britain and Ireland and in the colonies. Particularly in New England, which in our history textbooks we often learn about New England and the Puritans often as the cradle of American liberty, as people who came to the New World to escape religious persecution, and they're held up as such in our textbooks that we read as 5th graders. But if you read more about them, you realize that they themselves were very exclusionary. They were exclusive towards the established Church of England, which they despised as being too Catholic. They, of course, hated Catholics. They hated Quakers, too, in particular. In Massachusetts, it was punishable by death to be one.
Really?
Anyways, they were particularly anti-Jacobite, particularly because James' governor over the Northeast, called the Dominion of New England, had been very unpopular, and ultimately he'd been overthrown by armed rebellion there shortly after William and Mary ascended in England. But all of that helped sort of set the tone for a connection between anti-Catholicism and the idealism that was strong in both Great Britain and in the American colonies during the 18th century, on the eve of the Revolution. And in the article, as I will continue on from that point, I will cover the history of the U.S. in regards to Catholicism as well.
And you had said you wanted to continue writing about these articles up until when JFK, John F. Kennedy, became the first Catholic president and the only Catholic president of the United States. What made that a good stopping point? Or would you want to go farther and talk about more recent events in Catholic history?
It was a good stopping point because even though it wasn't something that happened overnight, it marked Catholics becoming part of the American mainstream. You see, prior to that, Catholics in the United States often formed a political and socioeconomic bloc. It was something that really you didn't see as much of anymore after the 1960s and 70s. And you don't see at all today because we're so integrated into the American mainstream that we're all very diverse. Just as diverse as any Americans.
And I had watched a documentary a little while ago about when John F. Kennedy went to go visit the Pope. And that was a really big issue for people because people were wondering, oh, is he going to, kiss the ring of the Pope when he goes and meets him? Because for some people, that was a sign that their president was bowing down to the authority of the Pope, basically resigning himself and saying, I'm not the most powerful man in the United States. I'm going to listen to whatever the Pope says.
Yeah, that was a fear that was prominent in the minds of Americans for a very long time leading up to the 1960 election. Ones that he had to personally address when he gave his famous speech to a gathering of Protestant ministers, in which he had to very explicitly explain that his Catholic faith would not interfere with his conduct as president, and that he believed that separation of church and state was sacred and absolute. And ultimately for me, what I find very interesting about it was it was the culmination of a very long process of Catholic political action in the United States, which was to ultimately reverse this perception of Catholicism as being the antithesis of American liberty that had really begun in 17th century England, and Catholics, particularly in the Irish American brand of Catholicism, which came to dominate and came to shape most what we know as Catholicism in America today. That brand of Catholicism helped take action in using this American ideology in favor of Catholics to say we Catholics deserve our religious liberty as well. It was something that was a long process that was very prominent during the 19th century as well as the 20th, because of course Catholics had to fight against discriminatory action both on the private and public levels. And ultimately culminated in 1960 with JFK's speech telling the country that separation of church and state and religious freedom are absolute and should apply to Catholics as well. the way he put it was that a religious test would undermine the liberty of a quarter of the population, and there would be nothing more un-American than that. And he also used historical references. For example, he brought up how he had recently visited the Alamo. He listed off Irish surnames that he had seen on the list of the dead. And he said, but we never know their religion because there was no religious test there. So ultimately it was a long process, but it was one of American Catholicism becoming what it is today, and ultimately, ironically, why we don't know much about it, because JFK and all those before him were part of the struggle for religious freedom for Catholics. We now have it and don't realize that we were ever a persecuted, marginalized group to begin with.
And that's why we can look forward to your articles, which will be coming out very soon. And I'm really excited about this. I'm really excited to learn more about our faith and how it got to the point where it is today in America. And Rielley, I want to thank you for coming on to the podcast today, and hopefully we will be able to have you on again sometime very soon.
Be glad to.
All right, man. And with that, we are going to end the podcast for tonight. Thank you for listening. Ain'tThatCatholic.squarespace.com is the website where you can find more Catholic fun. Rielley's articles about the history of American Catholicism will be up there very soon. Thank you for listening. Thanks to Rielley for being here.